I love warships. It doesn't matter what navy or year. So, in today's video, I'll share my top 15 favorite warships of all time from any navy. Though, I should warn everyone, you'll see a bit of a bias later in the video, maybe even more than one. So, leave your guesses down below to see if you can guess it. I will try to keep each segment short so we aren't here for over an hour where that'd be very possible. So, without further ado, let's get on to the video. Coming in at number 15 is the first and only submarine on this list. One of the Balo class for various victories of World War II, and one of the most successful submarines of all time. A little too much. And while I like her for this alone, the thing I find most fascinating, and the reason I love her so much, is actually what brought her downfall in 1944. Her very own torpedo circled around and sunk her. It may sound weird, but she probably would have been scrapped anyways. So, while she's sitting on the waves today, that faulty torpedo means at least she's still around, in a way unlike some other submarines who were almost as good as her, like the USS Barb. Yet, they were scrapped as well. Her crew loved her, and so did the Navy for her effectiveness. The USS Tang definitely deserves the number 15 spot. Coming in at number 14 is the first light cruiser on this list, and the first British ship on the list, HMS Belfast. She has many war stories. I won't go into detail here, or we'd be here until Christmas. There's just something about the town class cruisers that I just love. The love she has gathered from the people and her caretakers makes her almost guaranteed to be here for generations to come. In an age where the British are finally realizing their mistakes of preserving almost no warship from the world wars, it's nice to see that they care about the Belfast. I love Belfast for coming back from the dead after breaking her back when she had a mine, and still being here today. She is one tough light cruiser, and I like tough ships that can't be beaten, and for everything she's done, been through, and love it from the people, HMS Belfast definitely deserves number 14 spot on this list. Coming in at number 13 is the only battle cruiser on this list, and the second and last British ship on the list. HMS Hood was the pride of the British fleet. She was known as the Mighty Hood, and by far the most well-known battle cruiser of all time, and by far my favorite. She was loved by all, even after she was sunk by the mighty Bismarck in 1940. I love her for so many reasons. Hood was an amazing ship that was the pride of the Royal Navy. She was loved by so many. This, along with other reasons, is why HMS Hood definitely belongs in the 13th spot, and the spot as my favorite battle cruiser of all time on this list. Coming in at number 12 is the only heavy cruiser on the list, and the lone survivor of the Des Moines class of heavy cruiser. She by far not only is my favorite American cruiser, one of my favorite cruisers of all time, second only to one later on this list. I love her design, and she did her job with ease, and I love the look of her. Everything fits. I love heavy cruisers and their powerful guns, especially in triple turrets. There are too many good things to list here, so that's a video for another time. But the Salem definitely deserves the number 12 spot on this list, and the title of my favorite American cruiser of all time. Coming in at number 11 is the first Fletcher class destroyer on the list. It's the pirate destroyer herself, USS Kidd. The current Kidd flies the Jolly Roger flag, but this was started by this USS Kidd, aka Pirate Kidd. Who doesn't love a destroyer flying the Jolly Roger in a battle? Like, seriously, that terrified the enemy. She was one of the plentiful Fletcher class destroyers of World War II, but she stood out with her nickname, Pirate of the Atlantic and Pacific, and she lived up to that. I adore destroyers, and the Kidd is one of my favorites. There are so many things I love about her that they need their own video. She deserves number 11 and higher on the destroyer-only tier list. Coming in at number 10 is the second destroyer on this list and the second of the Fletchers. One of my favorite destroyers of all time, named after the tragic death of the 5 Sullivan brothers aboard the USS Juno. She is the pride of Buffalo, and one of my favorite American destroyers that has been preserved. Although, only one can top her, and it's not preserved. She was sunk during World War II, but that destroyer is actually going to come up later on this list. I love the Sullivans, and she has a strong community around her to this day in her museum state, and she has a following that's been gathered for generations. While she might be retired, at least the name is carried in service by yet another destroyer. She is the living reminder why ships don't have all siblings on board anymore, and why the American Navy has adopted the sole survivor policy. The Sullivans is also a living reminder of the 5 lost brothers and their amazingly brotherly bond. That is one of the main reasons why I love the USS The Sullivans so much. Coming in at number 9 is the first and only destroyer escort on this list, the USS Samuel B. Roberts. I loved other preserved destroyer escorts as well, but none even come close to the Roberts. He wasn't the best, the largest, the fastest. However, he, along with the entirety of Taffy 3 during the Battle of Samar, held their own as a small force of escort carriers and even fewer destroyers and destroyer escorts. They went against the force led by Yamato herself. I love Samuel B. Roberts for his crew's actions, and the fact they never gave up. If there was a shell, they were gonna fire it at the Japanese no matter what. Didn't matter if it was high explosive, armor piercing, or one of the illuminating star shells. In another video, I'll go over each ship of the battle and their role, but to keep this short, even though the Roberts sunk, there has never been a small destroyer escort that was as effective as him. He's also the world's deepest known shipwreck, and that's why I love the USS Samuel B. Roberts so much, and he deserves the number 9 spot on this list. Coming at number 8 is the last Fletcher, the last American destroyer on this list. The USS Johnston was also sunk during the Battle of Samar, just like the Roberts, and was the world's deepest known shipwreck until the wreck of the Roberts was found. Johnston threw everything she had at the Japanese force, so much so that they thought she was at least a cruiser, as no destroyer captain would be risky enough to charge at the Japanese force at the battle head-on. I'm not going to go over everything about the battle, as I mentioned in the last section, otherwise I'd be repeating myself. She was defiant, tough as nails, the courage of her crew, and the fact that she's the second deepest shipwreck as of 2023. The USS Johnston definitely deserves the number 8 spot on this list, and is by far my favorite American destroyer of all time, and I don't think that will ever change. Coming in at number 7 is the first and only Canadian cruiser on this list, and the last light cruiser/cruiser on this list entirely. HMCS Ontario served Canada well and is the pinnacle, in my opinion at least, of Canadian cruisers, even though she was a British Minotaur light cruiser and was actually the lead ship of the class of 3. Only Ontario was in Canadian service, the other 2 stayed with the British. She was built at the Harland and Wolff shipyard and was transferred to Canada before completion. And I love British light cruisers, and Ontario is not only one, but she's also the pinnacle of Canadian cruisers. It is a shame that she was only in service for 13 years, like so many built at the very end of the war. But she did her job well, and it's truly a tragedy that she is no longer with us. I love HMCS Ontario, and I always will. Ontario is not only my favorite Canadian cruiser, but is my favorite cruiser of all time. Coming in at number 6 is the first Canadian destroyer on this list. The third of the Iroquois class of destroyers, although she was actually the second commissioned, beating out the second numbered ship of the class by a few months. She was the second last Canadian destroyer and the last Canadian destroyer in active service. HMCS Athabaskan was the third Canadian ship to bear the name, and they were all destroyers. She carried the legacy of the first 2 Athabaskans with pride. She was the pride of the Navy in a way, with her name's history, and that was not lost on those who served on her, and those of us who love her. She was a ship that could do her job and do it with ease. She was, in my opinion at least, the best offensive ship in the Navy for many years. While she was scrapped about 6 years ago and is no longer with us, her name will hopefully be carried on by another ship in the future. I love HMCS Athabaskan 3, DDG 282, and I always will. And hopefully, Canada will one day get more destroyers, but honestly, who really knows? Coming at the number 5 spot is the last and the longest serving Canadian aircraft carrier. She was adored by her crew and the general public. HMCS Bonaventure was amazing. And I love Canadian carriers, but the first two, they can't even come close to the Bonnie as she was known. The last of the 3 Canadian carriers, she served alongside neither of them. She may have been scrapped in 1970, and even though it's been 53 years, there has never been another Canadian carrier since. She was the pride of the Royal Canadian Navy for her 13 service years. I love carriers, especially the Canadian carriers, and the Bonnie was by far my favorite Canadian carrier. Most love HMCS Bonaventure, and I do too. I have always been fascinated by the Canadian carriers and why they were gotten rid of. HMCS Bonaventure is a Canadian legend, and hopefully she will never be forgotten, and hopefully Canada may at some point in the future get another carrier. Coming in the number 4 spot is the first tribal class destroyer on this list, and the second ship to be named Athabaskan, both on this list and in the numerical order of the 3 Athabaskans. She was named after the first Athabaskan, which was sunk in 1944. But that's a story for another day. She carried on her lost sister's legacy, even though she was completed just a bit too late to join in the Second World War. She was a perfect replacement for her lost sister, and did her job well, and was loved by crews. She may have been scrapped in 1970, but her legacy was carried on by the 3rd HMCS Athabaskan that I mentioned earlier, and her tribal legacy to this day is still carried on by HMCS Haida. I love HMCS Athabaskan DDE 219/R79, and I always will, no matter what. Coming in at number 3 spot is the second tribal class destroyer on this list, and the 3rd Athabaskan on this list, and was the first HMCS Athabaskan in the Royal Canadian Navy, and was Haida's closest sibling in action. She was lost in 1944 to German torpedoes, yet she started the legacy of her name and of the tribals. She was the only Canadian tribal to ever be sunk, both during war and in naval exercises. And there are several photos of her and Haida together. On the night of her sinking, in fact, she was with Haida, hunting German destroyers. However, that is a story for another day. I love HMCS Athabaskan, number 1 for her effectiveness in her very short service career, yet she is so often remembered for only being Haida's closest sister ship, not for what she did during her short career. I love HMCS Athabaskan for what she did, and the bond that she and Haida had with both the ships and their crews. It is my hope that she will never be forgotten. And that's why I love HMCS Athabaskan G07, the very first one, so much. Coming in at second place is the flagship of the American Reserve Warship Fleet, the last American battleship after Wisconsin beat her to the finish line, after a strike delayed construction, making the USS Missouri BB-63, the last of not only the Iowa class, but the very last American battleship. Today, Missouri watches over the wreck and grave of the USS Arizona. But in her long service career, she was an absolute legend. From her service during World War II, with it ending on her decks, the Korean War, and the one that followed with few exceptions, she is adored by most. She is by a ridiculously large margin my favorite battleship of all time, and one of my favorite warships of all time. I can't imagine a better battleship to take her place in my heart. It's just not possible. If HMCS Haida wasn't this China's icon, Missouri would be in her place. There are a million reasons I love her, and maybe I'll post a video about it in the future. She's so deserving of second place that it wasn't even a question to put her in here. I hope one day I can get out to Hawaii to see her in person, and when I do, you will all probably join me on that journey. I love USS Missouri BP-63, and I always will. Now, without further delay, I present to you my favorite ship of all time. I'm sure this doesn't come as a surprise, considering my channel logo. My favorite ship of all time is only the sole surviving Tribal class destroyer, but the last surviving Canadian destroyer, above the waves. She's the flagship, the fightingest ship in the Navy, and the pride of the Royal Canadian Navy. Of course, it is the legendary HMCS Haida is the most loved and dangerous Canadian naval ship of all time. Haida has always served her country well. For her first 20 years as a naval ship, then, ever since, as a museum ship. I love destroyers, as this list shows, but Haida tops them all. Haida isn't only Canada's flagship, but the flagship of my channel. I will always pick Haida over any other ship without a doubt. I have, and always will, love the legendary HMCS Haida. Haida is a symbol of not only the Royal Canadian Navy, but also of Canada. She has sunk the most tonnage of any Royal Canadian Navy ship in history, and during the Korean War, she even joined the famed Train Busters Club. Yeah, that's pretty cool that she's blown up trains. She is also, as I mentioned earlier, the icon of this channel. She carries the legacy of not only the Canadian Navy during World War II, the 27 tribal destroyers of the British, Australian, and Canadian navies, but also the legacy of Canadian destroyers being the only one left above the ocean. I love HMCS Haida, and that will never change. I hope to see her one day, and she truly belongs in the #1 spot as not just my favorite warship of all time, but by far my favorite ship of all time.